Hello, and I hope you can hear me. My name is Giles Wayland-Smith, and I'm delighted to be here speaking to you today on the Oneida community. This is a community with which I have very deep connections over an extended period of time. Indeed, all of my kin on both sides of my family were members of this utopian community. And after it broke up in 1881, it transferred itself into a corporation, and all of the succeeding generations continued to work for that particular corporation, Oneida Limited. And as we see here, this 100,000 square foot building that the community built for themselves, I lived about 200 yards away from this all of my life, and my great-great-grandmother, Harriet Skinner, was the sister of John Humphrey Noyes, the person who was the founder of this particular community. But let me talk a little bit give you an overview of the community, because what I want to do as we move along is to talk about not only this particular community and its successor, the corporation, Oneida Limited, but also to talk about what I think are the lessons that we can learn from that experience. Let me begin by saying that the Oneida community was a religiously based community. And the members of this particular community believed quite literally that they could create heaven on earth. These people called themselves perfectionists and Bible communists. At its height, they had about 300 people in the community. This is a picture of some of those members in the 1860s. And it lasted for 33 years, from 1848 to 1881. The Oneida community was just one among many, dozens upon dozens of utopian communities that were created in the 19th century, many of which were responses to a religious revival called the Second Great Awakening that was sweeping this part of the world in the middle of the 19th century. But the Oneida community itself was perhaps one of the most radical, one of the most successful, and one of the most long-lived of those communities. I think two things to me are of interest and importance about the Oneida community. First, while the community itself was made up of idealists, at the same time, these people who were members of the community were down-to-earth New England pragmatists and very savvy business entrepreneurs. They recognized right from the beginning that if they were going to create heaven on earth, if they were going to create this good society, this very livable, this very civilized, this very liberating society, they were going to have good ideas, a lot of hard work, and money. So that what they did early on was to start a series of businesses which made them the kind of money that not only enriched their daily life in the community, but also provided the means to proselytize their Bible communist, their perfectionist religious ideas. And the things that they produced were, on the left, animal traps. These people became the largest animal trap manufacturer in the country, later the world. They also, about midway through the community, started making dyed silk thread. They put on spools which could take advantage of the new sewing machines and the transformation of the textile business itself. And as we see down in the lower right-hand corner, they were also preserving their own fruits and vegetables. So this is the first thing that I think that we have to keep in mind. The second thing is that the Oneida community, as I mentioned, did break up in 1881 for a whole variety of internal and external reasons. But unlike most of these 19th century communities, this community didn't dissolve, didn't disappear. Rather, as I mentioned, they transformed themselves quite seamlessly into a joint stock corporation. And each of the members of the community received a share, amount of stock certificates that was proportionate to when they joined and what kinds of assets they brought with them into the community. And this particular successor corporation, which was originally known as the Oneida Community Limited, and then in the 1930s it shortened its name to Oneida Limited, became the largest, or one of the largest, if not the largest, silverware manufacturer in the world. And this was the sales office, this was the administrative center that they built in 1926 to house the management of this new corporation. And as I want to talk about towards the end of this lecture, these people in the corporation translated a number of those values that they had from the original community into this very progressive form of welfare capitalism. In other words, they took those egalitarian values and created a business that reflected those particular values. Now, what I want to do is give you more background, but before I do, and give you some more visual as well as my own ideas on what the daily life looked like, et cetera. Just a couple of words about the word utopia. As you may or may not know, the word utopia comes from the Greek word utopos, which really literally means a no place, an imagined place. But the Greeks, who were very savvy philosophers 2,500 years ago, never really ever talked about utopos, a no place, without talking about an eutopos, a good place. So that they were always trying to marry their idea, their imagination of what a good place would look like with an actual examination of good places. And what the Oneidans really believed unreservedly was that they were not just creating a good place, they were trying to create a perfect place. They were trying to create literally heaven on earth, here and now. Now, how did they get there? As I mentioned, they called themselves two things: Bible communists, perfectionists, and Bible communists. Let me take each of those and just say a few words about each one. Perfectionism beginning. The founder of the Oneida community was this man here, John Humphrey Noyes. He was born in Vermont. He went to Dartmouth College. He graduated from Dartmouth College and was going to become a lawyer. But he was swept up in this revival, this second great awakening, and had a religious epiphany, if you will. And so rather than going into law school, becoming a lawyer, he went to Yale Divinity School. But very early on, or very quickly, he came into some difficulty there for the simple reason that John Humphrey Noyes, through his reading of the Bible, through his understanding and conversations and influences coming from elsewhere, believed that people could become perfect, like Christ was perfect. People could become sinless as Christ was sinless. This is a heretical idea, a completely unorthodox idea. But he came upon this idea by his reading of the Bible, which argued that the second coming of Christ, as both Catholic and Protestant denominations would argue, is a future event. We're looking forward to the second coming of Christ. But according to John Humphrey Noyes, the second coming of Christ was a past event. It happened in 70 AD with the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. And what that meant was that everybody could become perfect as Christ was perfect, sinless as Christ was sinless, because the second coming was a past event and the kingdom of God was being realized in the here and now. So that this is the way they envisioned, if you will, history, with this second coming as it shows here in 70 AD, and setting in motion this resurrection church, and people could become perfect. This, as you might imagine, got him kicked out of Yale Divinity School. But what it did do at the same time was to gain him this group of followers of perfectionists who felt they could create heaven on earth. That raises the whole question of the second idea, Bible communism. As I mentioned, the Oneidas believed that people could become perfect, could become sinless. And how could they do that? By doing away with ownership of private property. By doing away with ownership of private property. And they go to the Bible in the book of Acts, where they talk about the primitive church, the church in the first century of Christ's life and after his death and resurrection, of the early church holding all property in common and sharing the wealth of that community among all the people as their needs saw fit. So they said, okay, then we are Bible communists, and we are going to do away with any kind of private ownership of things. But they took it one enormously and radically move further. They said we can also own people. And they argued that monogamous marriage was a form of ownership. And so, again, going back to the Bible, wherein the gospel according to Luke, they say Christ is shown as saying, in heaven one is neither given nor taken in marriage. Therefore, since we are in heaven, this is the kingdom of God here and now, we should not be married monogamously. But every adult man and woman will be married to everybody else, and they will be able to have both loving relationships and access to each other in terms of free consensual sex. So they come up with this idea of doing away with monogamous marriage and creating what they call complex marriage. But they went even further than that. This is what you can imagine got them into at least some forms of difficulty because of this very radical idea. But they also said, we only want as many children as we can afford, as we can care for, as we can raise. So these people created their own form of contraception, which they called male continence, which involves a lack of male orgasm. What this did, as you might imagine, this was somewhat difficult process to manage, but at the same time, it was quite successful. There were in the 33 years that they had this community, there were only 98 children born. And in the first 20 years, when they didn't have a lot of money, there were only 2 children born every year, 40 children in those first 20 years. Then when they did have enough money so that they felt they could have as many children as they wanted because they could feed them, they could clothe them, they could educate them, they could take care of them in the way in which they saw fit. They created a kind of eugenics program where they thought they could bring people together and create a spiritually advanced as well as advanced group of children. And in the next 11 years, from 68 to 79, when they gave up complex marriage, they had 58 children, planned children. And what is remarkable here in this very sexually active community was the fact that over that 33-year period, 65% of all those children, 65% of those children were planned. This is a picture of the people, again, emphasizing the fact that everybody is, if you will, married to each other. Everybody is socializing. Everybody is part of this community of equals. And these are people, all of whom, as adults, are married to each other and who have the possibility of consensual sex, as long as it didn't pull those people towards themselves and away from the larger community. The primal sin of the Oneida community was what they called special love. In other words, if a man had a special love for a woman for a man, and that pulled you away from the larger community and your responsibility to it, that was the cause of the community intervening in a particular way to right that situation. But it could also be the special love of a parent for a child, which was natural and inevitable, but it shouldn't be so close that it pulled you away from your love and attention and care for the other children of the community. Or it could even be the love of a person for a thing. My great grandfather, Frank Wayland-Smith, was a concert-level violinist, and he had a violin, and every once in a while, according to the diary that I've inherited, he would receive word from John Humphrey Noyes that he was in the special love relationship. He was taking too much pleasure in playing it or practicing or getting a swelled head and how good he was, and he would force him to lock it up, to purge himself of that special love and to get back into the larger community. And what they had here was a form of what they call mutual criticism, where people were getting sticky, either with one another, a parent for a child, or sticky with a thing, to get you back into the larger community. A final thing about Bible communism was there's no question that John Humphrey Noyes was at the center of this community. He was the spiritual head of the community, but he was also the administrative or the daily head of the community. But what he did was to surround himself with others, both men and women, and we'll get into that point in a minute, of the equality of men and women in this particular community. But he surrounded himself with a group of people, a fairly large group of people, men and women, who were a central committee. And also, when he was not there, the person on the far left and the person on the far right were those who would take over the daily life of the community and manage the community. So there was a kind of it wasn't an authoritarian regime. And beyond that fact, there was also a series of about 20 or 25 committees that would oversee the entire life of the community, their businesses, the education of their children, their food and their entertainment. All of these things were done by committee. So there was a kind of democratization on the ground. So that's what we mean by perfectionism and Bible communism. And there's no way of understanding this community and what went on without sort of understanding those sort of key pieces of it. But let me just turn to the daily life. And there's 5 things that I just want to talk about, how the daily life, what the daily life looked like. The first thing about the daily life here, that this was a place of serious work. People worked here seriously, even if by 19th century standards, the workday was unusually short and unusually varied in a variety of different ways. What we find here, for example, is the fact that they had job rotation, that men did women's work, women did men's work. What you have here are sort of cartoons of one of the members who were showing men in the laundry room, men waiting on tables, men in the kitchen. But as the community moved along, it was not only men doing women's work and vice versa, but women working in the factory as supervisors, as accountants, as editors of their publications, et cetera. So there was this equality of labor that was extraordinarily unusual for that period of time. And when things got tough, there were big orders, in this case, for traveling bags that they made. They had what they called bees, where everybody would come together to harvest crops or to make these or to get animal trap orders out into the marketplace. But these people were enormously inventive and active manufacturers. These people, unlike so many other communes, were manufacturers. These people were moving in concert, in many ways, leading the Industrial Revolution itself. They were not just agriculturalists. One of their members, a man by the name of Sewell Newhouse, was a trapper and a blacksmith, and he had invented these traps. That's why in some places they allowed his name to be on the traps, and other times it was just the Oneida community. But he was only able to hand forge about 1,000, 1,500 of these a year. But they said, we need money if we're going to succeed, if we're going to become a model of perfect society here on earth, and we need money. So they persuaded him to show him how they did it, and they then created the machine tools that would allow them to produce these traps. So from about 1,000, 1,500 to 2,000 by the 1870s in a new factory, first on one side of the community and then about a mile away, they were producing about 450,000 of these a year. They were the largest manufacturer of these animal traps in the country, later the world. They also became manufacturers of these silk threads, and again were able to take advantage of this whole transformation of the textile industry. This made them a ton of money also. And one of these women here is a member of the community, a supervisor of the silk girls, and all of these girls from the neighboring village of Oneida itself, about 3 miles away, were working there in the silk mill. But they also preserved their own fruits and vegetables. And this was the large building where that process, where canning in glass jars, those fruits and vegetables took place. And then, of interest to the later history, down here, not far from here, in Wallingford, Connecticut, they had a branch community. And in that branch community, towards the end of the community days in the 1870s, they started manufacturing spoons. And these are showing the spoon molds and the spoons themselves. This was a very primitive level of manufacture early on, but it became the foundation of what was later the success of the Oneida Limited Corporation. So that was the first thing. This was a place that worked hard because they wanted the Jack to be able to have a rich life, a full life as a community, an enriched life, but also to have the money to proselytize this model, to become a model for the rest of the world. The second thing that characterized the life was this constant search for improvement, both individually and as a community. This idea of perfection or improvement came from the idea of being perfect or trying to become perfect, trying to elevate yourself. But right from the beginning, they recognized that education was the key to this. And here again, I'll come back to a word. The term education comes from the Latin word educere, to lead out. To be educated is to be led out of where you are into new worlds, to be taught new things, to develop your own capacities. And what these people believed was that everybody, individually, men and women, old and young, everybody had a set of capacities, a set of abilities, and it was the job of education to realize those, to develop those capacities that people had. And if you could bring all of those people together in the community, having released men and women, old and young alike, to develop their capacities, look how much you could produce and how well you could produce it, as they did in their businesses. And so in the Mansion House, this becomes the library. In this particular library, in the middle of the 19th century, they had between 3,500 and 4,000 books. They subscribed to all the major newspapers, all the major magazines. But it's not just books, it was books across the spectrum. In other words, it was novels, it was fiction, it was poetry, it was books about birds and ornithology and history and biology and chemistry. What they wanted to create were what we might call Renaissance men and women, well-developed, fully developed, educated men and women. Every young boy and girl in the community was educated up through high school. And I came across some figures not too long ago of a census of the 1870 census, United States Census, which showed back in 1870, precisely at this time, that only 48% of 5 to 19-year-olds were going to school. And the average length of time they went to school was 78 days. And of those who were going to school, only 2% graduated with a high school degree. Every boy and girl in the United Community was educated up through high school, and they sent 13 of their young men for further education to Yale. So this just goes to show how important education was. And this gets reflected in the architecture and the design of the Mansion House. This is in the big hall that I'll show you a picture of. And on the ceiling of the big hall are four emblems, if you will. There's the muse of history, the muse of astronomy, the muse of music, and the goddess Dike. So if you look at it this way, what they said was what we would call the social sciences is part of knowledge, history, the natural sciences, astronomy, that we find here is part of knowledge, and music, the humanities, is part of knowledge. And overarching all of that and binding all of that together is justice, the scales and the balance. You've got to have all of those, and that's what they said they would have here. Thirdly, they recognize that there is such a thing as an architecture of community. By that I mean every society develops its own architecture. That is, its own style of buildings and the way those buildings and spaces are linked to nature and to the rest of the built environment. What's important is that every society's architecture is divided into public spaces, public buildings and spaces that bring the community together, that reinforce their bonds as a community, that provide places where these people's lives and skills and aptitudes can be developed in community. But they also have private spaces where more intimate needs and more localized needs can be met. So there's an architecture of public and private space that societies developed. And what the community recognized was that they needed to create in that mansion house that I showed you, and I'm going to show you a lot more pictures of now, of public and private spaces, places that brought people together, that reinforced their identity as members of this community, but private spaces where they could be by themselves. And that the lawns and gardens around that also were both public and, in a sense, private. But they were all beautiful and all functional in terms of developing these capacities of people. But when we look at these spaces, this is the big hall, right at the center of the mansion house. This is where the life of the community came together every evening, where the religious life of the community took place, where the cultural life, the entertainment life of the community took place, where they entertained themselves, where mutual criticisms took place if things were getting sticky and special love was erupting in a particular way. But here, 4 years after HMS Pinafore, Gilbert and Sullivan's light opera went on the stage in London, because these people had their own orchestra, their own choral groups, and a rake stage in the big hall, they put that performance on here and then took it on the road to neighboring communities so they could have the wealth of that experience brought to them. But they also recognized that they needed smaller places that would bring people together. This is the so-called upper sitting room just off the big hall. Again, fairly elegant, but welcoming so that people could socialize there, so that people would have places to come together, and where the children of the community, those 100 children born into the community, could come and entertain the others. But also, across the road from the mansion house was this very large, very elaborate school building. This is where these children, boys and girls alike, were educated up through high school. And they also recognized that people ought to have healthy lives, active lives in a variety of ways. They had Turkish baths in the middle of the mansion house, there in the background, but this rather elaborate building was a playhouse for the children of the community on the south lawn. Again, so that they would be out in fresh air, they would be having lots of toys and lots of places to entertain themselves. But again, as a community, not as a monogamous family, but as members of this very large family indeed. Another thing was on the north lawn, a summer house where in the heat of the summer people could collect and have a good time. You'll notice here that the women had a very unusual garb. They had pantalettes and an overdress. This is the time of high Victorian style with very elaborate, with crinolines and corsets and bustiers, etc., with underdresses, overdresses, with long hair, etc. They said, we're going to crop our hair short, and we're going to have the freedom of movement and the ease of movement of these little pantalettes and a very loose-fitting smock over it. But they also recognize that people need private space. People need private space for a lot of different reasons. Here, you needed private space, one for the development of your spiritual life, the further development of your spiritual life, but you needed private space for your sexual life. This was a sexually active community. And so you needed private rooms in order to have that take place, what they called interviews. But these small rooms were about 8 by 12 because, and they look something like a monastic cell because they're comfortable, they're well lit, they're well ventilated, but they also wanted these to always be coming out into public space. So you can have privacy, but they didn't want you to squirrel yourself away from the larger community. The fourth thing that was characteristic of the community was this conscious belief that the good society ought to be a comfortable society, that the good life, that heaven on earth ought to be comfortable. It ought to be beautiful, but it also ought to be comfortable. We don't see it here as much as in some of the others, but this building in the 1870s was centrally heated. This building had indoor plumbing by the 1870s. This building had its own form of air circulation, so in the heat of the summer, air was constantly being moved in and out of the building. They had a very healthy, well-balanced diet. They made sure, again, by virtue of their understanding of this architecture of community, that their manufacturing buildings, et cetera, ought to be away from the residential buildings so that the contamination, if you will, potentially from those trap-making factories, the silk factories, and others wouldn't be interfering with the daily life of the community. And finally, that the lawns and gardens ought to surround this and ought to reflect Eden itself. They were creating the new Eden, so they wanted this to look Edenic with walkways and summer houses and gardens that were welcoming people to come and enjoy. So unlike, if you will, the developing factory system where people were chained, old and young alike, for desperately long hours and in desperate conditions, they said, this is what heaven on earth really looks like. And that leads to the fifth element about this community. In other words, their sophisticated, open-ended, positive relations with the larger world around them. They recognized they couldn't survive without having enough money to survive, but they also recognized that they lived in a world where these ideas of complex marriage, of male continence, of raising all of these children as children of this complex married society had to be dealt with. They had to have good relations with their neighbors. And they did that in a couple of different ways. On the larger scene, they were publishing all the time. And they had the Oneida Circular, their own daily circular, what later becomes known as the American Socialists, but all these pamphlets on who they were. So they're publishing all the time to let people know who they were, what they were about, and why this looked so good. But they also said, we want to be a model of what the good life, what the good society looks like, what heaven on earth looks like. So we welcome people here to look at this. And there was a railroad running right close to the mansion house, and they would be bringing in 500, 600, 700 people at a time to eat their food, to go to a strawberry fest, or to just look at what heaven on earth appears to be. I came across some figures in the circular not very long ago, which showed that between 1863 and 1868, there were 48,000 visitors to the mansion house. 48,000 visitors who they welcomed in to see what this looked like. And on a more localized level, they recognized we also have to have good relations. And they did that primarily by becoming the largest landowner, but also the largest employer in the area. There were 300 members of the community, but 300 members employed by the community businesses. And not only that, but they were good employers. They paid well above average wages for the area. They made property available so that those people could have a small church or one denomination of a small church in the area. They made tenement houses available so that they could have reasonable rents to very good housing. So they had all of these kinds of ways of keeping their immediate neighbors, thinking of them very, very positively. Well, now, let me just summarize all of this by saying, once you've seen all of this, what did they get right? What lessons can we learn from this community? And here, there's several things that I want to mention. The first, and I think my most important point, would be that every person has, to a greater or lesser extent, many talents and a capacity to grow. So even if their belief that people could become perfect wasn't, I think, accurate, their idea that everybody can develop, everybody can self-actualize, everybody has a set of capacities that can be enlarged. I think that idea that everybody has that capacity, they got right, because I think that is right. Secondly, in a corollary, they said that that capacity to grow, that capacity to self-actualize, is not gender-specific, it's not age-specific. Everybody has that capacity to grow. And it is through education that that is going to be taking place, as I will come to. Thirdly, the Oneidans insisted that the good society is an abundant society. In other words, they recognized that the full richness of human life can only be realized when people are not living hand to mouth, are not living in scarcity, when a society's capacity to produce is able to meet everybody's needs. You have to have an abundant society, because then the only question is, how do you distribute that abundance? And as they said, if you distribute that abundance equally, men and women alike, old and young alike, the more developed or the more richly endowed people with the less richly endowed people, if you're all enjoying that wealth and sharing when things are not going well, the privation, that's the question. But their insistence upon becoming an abundant society, I think, also teaches us something. That we in the United States are an extraordinarily abundant society, but what they're raising for us to think about is, how is that abundance distributed? That's the question. That funnels in on the fundamental question that we have to ask, whether it was Karl Marx asking that question, or in this case, the Oneida community asking that question. The fourth thing that I think they got right was that education is liberating, both for the individual and for the society. It allows you to expand possibilities as an individual, but then also collectively as a society. And they recognized that applied knowledge of using technology in modern inventions and all of these new things to the advancement of abundance and to the advancements of the richness of life is critical. And they argued that all of this, whether it's for an individual or for a society, is a lifelong learning process. People don't stop learning, and societies don't stop learning. And that gets you where you need to get to. The next thing they got right was insisting that people are social beings. It doesn't mean that they're not individuals, but they are also social beings. They live in community. And there's always a kind of tension, or there's always a certain pull between the community and the individual. They recognize that. But they also recognize that the community is a place in which we all live, and it's in the community that wealth is created, and then from which wealth can be distributed. So if people need and exist as individuals and need private space and private rights as individuals, there's always the claim of community upon you. And finally, I think they got it right that there's a mixture of theory and practice. In other words, you can't just practice without any kind of theory, because that's just sort of doing something, or it's just sort of random behavior if you just act without any sort of idea or theory standing behind it. But if you have theory without practice, it's just sort of daydreaming. And what they said was, we've got to marry these and constantly test ourselves back and forth. So these people were doing that all the time, starting new things, but seeing what was going to work and what would create this heaven on earth. I'm running a little bit longer than I wanted. I want to run through these other things, which I'll do as quickly as possible, because I want to get into the successor community, the Oneida Limited. What we have here is, as I mentioned, the Oneida community broke up in 1881, and it created this corporation, Oneida Community Limited, which later becomes Oneida Limited. For a few years, for about 15 years, it was not a great success. But then this person, P.B. Noyes, one of the sons of John Humphrey Noyes, came along, and he took over the board of directors of Oneida Community Limited in 1895. And he was the equal of John Humphrey Noyes, but in a business sense, in a secular sense. He became the head of this new corporation. And he surrounded himself with both some older men within the community, but also some of the so-called stirpicults, members of that generation of eugenics experimentation in child rearing. And more importantly than anything else, what he decided was that by the early 1900s, silverware production, which had been moved from Wallingford up to Niagara Falls, was overtaking both animal trap manufacturing and soap manufacturing. And so that the future would probably be best served by focusing upon silverware. And that's what he started to do, starting in the early 1900s. This was a very risky venture, because silverware production, if you know anything about it, is extraordinarily capital intensive. It takes huge amounts of machines doing a lot of very complicated work. And there were also a whole range of other silverware manufacturers already in business. So to enter into this and try to gear up and to overcome that kind of competition was enormously risky. But they recognized that they'd had enormous success in the past, and why couldn't we do it in the future? And there are two things that they felt they had to do. One is they had to really design classic, good-looking stuff. And that's what you see they're beginning to do with the Avalon and other patterns, a far distance from that spoon that I showed you back in the Wallingford days. And they secondly said, the other thing we've got to do is to advertise. And they got two people, Coles Phillips and Maxfield Parrish. But this guy here, Coles Phillips, becomes enormously powerful advertiser of this silverware, making this whole new generation of 1920s and beyond young women think about, what is it I want to do? I want to get married, and when I want to get married, I want to be able to entertain well. And what does it mean to entertain well? To have this bloody silverware on my table. And that's what you're getting here from Coles Phillips in these advertisements, of these women now being advertised in Saturday Evening Post, in Ladies' Home Journal, in all of these magazines, showing these women gazing into their future, namely Oneida silverware. These just were enormously powerful and effective. This is a Maxwell Parrish advertisement. So this is, then what happened was, and this comes down to a subsequent point, the creation of the factory in Sherrill. They brought the factory from Niagara Falls down to what becomes known as the city of Sherrill. In 1913, Sherrill, what becomes Sherrill, had a population of about 200 people. By 1917, they had 3,500 people employed in their plants right near here. In order to bring those people, there were a number of unmarried people, and this is the way in which the company was translating those early collectivist values into this. They said, we're going to take care of these people. So unmarried people were going to build this dormitory so that these people from Niagara Falls can come here and live here before they start building homes along Kinsley Street and other streets that we're going to lay out, in which they began to build by giving their workers plots of land and giving them aid to mortgage payments and all the rest of it. So this idea of creating a good workforce, but also a well taken care of workforce. They not only allowed them to own their own houses, but they also created early on their own health care program. They also had a retirement program from the earliest days. And unusually, they also, as they show here in this cartoon, had a profit-sharing program so that when times were good, they would all share in that goodness. And when times were bad, they all shared in that downturn. One of the most things, again, one of the most interesting things, and in contrast to what we have today with golden parachutes, during the Depression, when everybody else was being laid off, they laid off virtually none of those 3,000 plus employees. And one of the ways in which they did that was by saying, the people at the top, the board of directors and our top executives will take a 35% pay cut. On the floor of the factory, it's 5%. Just the exact opposite. And they had already built in this idea that the difference between the highest paid and the lowest paid people is going to be as low as possible, not the 300 to 400 times the gap that we have today. So this is what they created for their workers, and the translation of those ideas into these kinds of corporate results. But they also created Sherrill itself as a model community, as an intentionally planned community. They said, we don't want to have us look like a Appalachian coal mining town where the coal mine has the company store and runs everything. We don't want this to look like Carnegie's Pittsburgh and the steel mills. We want this to look like a well taken care of family. And if this town is so small, 3,500 people, the only way we can allow it to have some independence is by going to New York State and persuading them that this should be made a city, even if its population doesn't merit city status. So they become a city with only 3,000 plus people. So they have their own independent government, their own elections, their own ability to decide things independent of the company, which is standing at the base of their fortunes. They also, in this town, made property available for all of the local denominations, Catholic and Protestant denominations. This is a church that was designed by my grandfather, Theodore Skinner, Plymouth Church. They made that available. The company also said education is not just important for everybody in general, but it's important for these people here. And my grandfather designed these two, and there's a third school that I don't have a picture of here. This is the middle school, and that's the high school that he designed. And the company paid for half of the construction costs of these particular buildings. They built their own libraries so that the people of Sherrill had their own library. They had their own little mini high street, or little mini mall, if you will, the so-called Skinner Block, where there was a grocery store, the dry goods store, a barber shop, a bank, and a pharmacy, et cetera, so that people could shop locally. They didn't have to go into the city of Oneida. And they also said people have to entertain themselves. So what was an old cow barn, a horse barn, became the CAC. In other words, the community associated clubs, where there were bowling alleys, basketball courts, pool tables, dance halls, rooms for various local clubs to meet, et cetera. And right next to that, a semi-professional level baseball field, band concert, et cetera, Noyes Field, where people could entertain themselves. So all of this is just leading to the fact that after the community broke up and the company took over, there are these other lessons to be learned, namely that businesses can act as a family, can see themselves as a family, rising and falling together, and with as equal a sharing of that wealth and deprivation, if you will, or privation, as possible, all within the framework of still making money, of still making investments for the future, but it can be seen as a family. The lesson that there can be a relatively narrow gap between top management and the bottom rungs. That can work. That can actually create identification and quality workmanship. And that also finally, when you look at a business as a community in which everybody is participating in some kind of way, you have two advantages. One is you have the advantage of being able to call upon a whole range of people's capacities and intellects and ideas. In other words, you've spread out the range of people you can call upon to give you good ideas, but you can also call upon those same people to rein you in when you're making bad decisions, for people in a family to say, that is a lousy idea. And that's another lesson that it seems to me that we come from this. So altogether, it seems to me what we have is an earlier community that failed but teaches us something, and a later company that also, regrettably, for a set of reasons that we need not go into, declared bankruptcy in 2006. But for many, many years, it's still producing silverware, but it's all offshore at this point. But we can still learn some lessons, it seems to me, from that corporate existence of what came out of the United Community. So I'm going to finally stop and see if you have any questions. Yes. About the field? Oh, yes. Yes, it's economy efficiency through cooperation. Through cooperation. Actually, that's another one of my grandfather's. That was his seal that he came up with. But I think it's really important, I think it really is important, you know, that they get city status for this so that there would be some distance and independence of people having their own electoral system. Now, it goes without saying that this was a paternalistic relationship. There's no question about that. But that what emerged, it seems to me, was really pretty exceptional. Yes. Of the I don't know that I can answer that directly. Just going off the top of my head. But the Iroquois nation surrounds all, is embedded in all of upstate central New York. And the Oneida nation, one of the Iroquois tribes, was literally 3 miles away from the nation. Originally, those lands were Oneida Nation lands. They had already been taken away from, or those lands, the Although at the end, just before the breakup, there was a threat of suing Noyes himself for special